You've probably heard the claim, if you're lean and metabolically healthy, high LDL cholesterol doesn't matter. In low-carb circles, this is more than just a claim. It's kind of a permission slip. Go ahead, load up on butter, bacon, and ribeyes. After all, you're in ketosis, right? But here's the real question. Is that confidence backed by science? Or just wishful thinking wrapped in six-pack abs? A new study, the KETO-CTA trial, set out to explore this very question. It followed 100 people on a long-term ketogenic diet, all with significantly elevated LDL cholesterol and ApoB, using coronary CT angiography to track changes in their arteries over 12 months. On the surface, the results might seem reassuring. But when you dig into the data and the way that the data has been presented, a more complex and very interesting picture starts to emerge. Whether you follow a ketogenic diet or have high LDL cholesterol yourself, care about someone who does, or are just generally interested about nutrition and cardiovascular disease, this episode is for you. With expert insight from my friend, Dr. Alan Flanagan, who co-authored a detailed critique of the study, we'll unpack what the research really found, how it's been communicated to the public, and what it truly means for the keto community. No hype, no hit pieces, just a clear-eyed, evidence-based look at the very first study to track artery plaque progression in lean, metabolically healthy people with keto-induced high cholesterol. The study we're unpacking, titled Plaque Begets Plaque, ApoB Does Not, longitudinal data from the KETO-CTA trial, was published a few months ago in the Journal of American College of Cardiology Advances. In a nutshell, the researchers wanted to answer a very specific question. Are lean, metabolically healthy individuals on a long-term ketogenic diet, people with sky-high LDL cholesterol and ApoB, actually at increased risk of plaque progression in their arteries? To answer that, they tracked these individuals for 12 months using coronary CT angiography, a highly precise imaging method that lets us see plaque forming within the artery walls. Now, the hypothesis behind this study is interesting. The thinking goes, maybe not all high cholesterol is problematic. These folks aren't overweight, they have good insulin sensitivity, normal triglycerides, and low levels of inflammation. So maybe, just maybe, their high ApoB levels, high LDL cholesterol level is less dangerous. And given that there is a resurgence in the number of people seemingly adopting a ketogenic diet, there is growing interest in whether or not this hypothesis is true. In fact, and it must be acknowledged, people on a ketogenic diet commonly report losing weight, seeing an improvement in their symptoms, but finding out at their doctor's visit that their cholesterol is sky high. Typically, doctors advise them to change course, lower saturated fat intake, consider taking statins, the sort of standard playbook for high LDL cholesterol. But some patients push back. They feel great, they're lean, and so they ask, what is my actual risk? Here's the problem. Until now, almost all of our cardiovascular risk data comes from general population studies, which include people with obesity, diabetes, smoking history, etc. Not this niche group of healthy keto dieters with isolated hyperlipidemia. So that is the gap in the literature that the KETO-CTA study aimed to fill. Before we dive into the results, there is some crucial context that you need to understand about how this study was designed. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is that despite the study title describing this as the KETO-CTA trial, this was not in fact a trial. In clinical research, the term trial implies a prospective interventional study, typically with randomized allocation, control groups, manipulation of variables, for example, assigning to a diet or medications, an effort to determine causality, etc. This study involved none of that. The researchers took 100 subjects already on a ketogenic diet, so they were self-selected, who met their inclusion criteria, which I'll describe shortly. Measured their LDL cholesterol and ApoB and plaque at baseline with a blood test, performed a CT angiogram and a coronary artery calcium scan, and then followed them for 12 months and remeasured these things. In fact, the authors pre-registered the study as an observational cohort, not a trial. So calling it a trial in the title feels misleading. This isn't just academic nitpicking. It really does affect how the public and the media interpret the results. So who were these subjects in the study? Essentially 100 self-selected keto dieters, all with very high LDL cholesterol, but otherwise normal metabolic markers. People who had been following a ketogenic diet for at least 24 months with an LDL cholesterol of 190 milligrams per deciliter or higher, who had otherwise healthy blood lipid and blood glucose results, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, fasting glucose, etc., and normal inflammation levels, normal blood pressure, without a history of metabolic disease, without genetically elevated cholesterol, and these subjects were not taking medications or supplements that affect cholesterol levels. So we're talking about a very specific subset of people, of the population, sometimes referred to as lean mass hyperresponders or LMHRs. Importantly, the researchers were primarily interested in the percent change of non-calcified plaque volume, or NCPV as it's abbreviated, and as it will come up in this episode quite a lot. Essentially, as the name implies, this is the total amount of plaque that is not calcified in the artery wall, which can be measured with a CT angiogram and modern software like Clearly, which they used in this study. And it's this soft plaque which is more vulnerable to rupturing and causing a heart attack or stroke than calcified or hard plaque. By doing a baseline and then a 12-month scan, they were able to see how much this soft plaque increased by. The secondary outcome was percent atheroma volume, whereas non-calcified plaque volume measures the absolute amount of plaque in millimeters cubed. Percent atheroma volume tells us what percentage of the artery wall contains plaque, calcified and non-calcified, essentially standardizing for vessel size, allowing for better comparisons between individuals. The researchers also reported associations between ApoB, LDL cholesterol levels, and plaque progression, and made this a focus in their abstract and discussion. But these analyses were not pre-specified in their study registration. That means that they are exploratory. They're interesting, but not something we can draw firm conclusions from. So to recap so far, we've got a unique group of healthy, long-term keto dieters with very high cholesterol. A 12-month observational study using cutting-edge imaging to track plaque progression, and a hypothesis that challenges mainstream cardiovascular risk models. But there are already some concerns, particularly around how the study was described as a trial and how results were presented and discussed. And with that, let's discuss the results and how they were presented, starting with the abstract. Right away, any researcher paying attention would notice something odd. The abstract and the title put a spotlight on ApoB, but here's the catch. As mentioned, ApoB wasn't even a pre-registered outcome. That alone is a giant red flag, but it gets worse. Further, and perhaps more importantly, other than saying ApoB level didn't correlate with change in non-calcified plaque volume, there was no mention of non-calcified plaque volume. That is to say, change in non-calcified plaque volume, the primary outcome, as measured in millimeters cubed, was not mentioned. In fact, it wasn't even mentioned in the paper itself. Let that sink in. The primary outcome of the study, the change in non-calcified plaque volume in millimeters cubed, either as an average or a median, was not mentioned in the paper. Not in the abstract, not in the results, nowhere. Despite the authors acknowledging this omission and saying it was a, and I quote, sincere oversight, not intentional or selective reporting, end quote, it still has not been corrected in the original manuscript. The authors did provide the primary outcome data on social media and in a recent response to a letter to the editor following what can only be described as public dismay. So what did the data actually show once it was finally revealed? It turns out the median change in non-calcified plaque volume was 18.9 millimeters cubed, and the mean change was 31.5 millimeters cubed. Now, to put that into perspective, a separate study using the same Clearly imaging software reported a median annual non-calcified plaque volume progression of just 4.9 millimeters cubed in healthy individuals not on lipid-lowering medications. That means the subjects in the KETO-CTA study who were lean, supposedly metabolically healthy, and keto-adapted showed nearly 4 times the plaque progression compared to normal, healthy individuals over the same period and using the same AI software to measure plaque progression. And that's not all. We also have data from subjects without obstructive coronary atherosclerosis and without diabetes who experience a reduction in non-calcified plaque volume over 12 months when taking optimal medical therapy alone, a mean change of minus 21.3 millimeters cubed, or optimal medical therapy plus the DASH diet, a mean change of minus 51.3 millimeters cubed. Let that comparison sit for a second. Seriously, people on a keto diet, lean and healthy, saw plaque grow by 31.5 millimeters cubed. That was the median, while those on conventional therapies actually shrank their plaque. Even more telling, the KETO-CTA researchers themselves had predicted only 7 millimeters cubed progression, citing the fact that their cohort was substantially younger with little to no risk factors. So when the actual number came in at over 4 times that estimate, it raises some serious questions. Now, some folks might push back here and say, well, we shouldn't compare non-calcified plaque volume between subjects. We should be using the secondary outcome, percent atheroma volume. Well, when we do that, we see a similar story. In this study, the baseline percent atheroma volume was 1.6%, and the median change in percent atheroma volume over 12 months for subjects was 0.8%. Here's what Dr. Alan Flanagan had to say about this.
Where they stratified individuals based on their cardiovascular risk score into 3 different groups. They had a low risk strata, an intermediate risk strata, and a high risk strata. This was based on 10-year atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk scores. So the low risk less than 7.5%, intermediate risk 7.5%, high risk over 20%. And so for context, the annualized rate of percent atheroma volume change in this group, in each of these risk categories, was 0.99% for the high risk group, 0.45% for the low risk group, and 0.58% for the intermediate risk group. So this group that they have self-proclaimed as metabolically healthy individuals have a greater rate of progression than the low cardiovascular risk group and paradigm and the intermediate risk group, and their actual rate of change is closer to what we observed in the high risk group. And when we look at the relationship between annualized change in percent atheroma volume and risk of future major adverse cardiovascular events observed in the same paradigm study cohort, the rate of change of 0.93% in PAV was associated with a 23% higher risk of future cardiovascular events. So they are closer to that than they are to low risk. And so to describe these individuals as metabolically healthy, and I think we can apply a criteria here because you might be familiar with this concept of metabolically healthy obesity, which was a kind of a debated topic in the literature for a few years. And part of the problem with the definition, it was based on metabolic syndrome criteria. But part of the problem with the suggestion that there was this true phenotype was that often, because there are 5 metabolic syndrome criteria, the definition for metabolically healthy allowed for the presence of 2 elevated risk factors. Now, someone with 2 elevated risk factors, hypertension and, high C-reactive protein or some, anyone with 2 elevated risk factors is not healthy. And I think that we now need to apply the more stringent definition that people have started to apply in that area, which is 0 elevated risk factors, to this concept of this phenotype. And if we are truly to designate these individuals as healthy, then we should not be seeing the rate of plaque progression over 1 year that we've seen.
Now, the authors have stated that anything at or below a percent atheroma volume increase of 1% is not considered rapid plaque progression. Specifically, they've stated, and I quote, "The majority of the participants showed percent atheroma volume changes below the agreed upon definition for rapid plaque progression of greater than 1% per year." End quote. I looked at their reference for that, and frankly, the paper itself does not reflect their position here. It says, and I quote, "There is no established threshold for significant plaque progression as assessed by volumetric computed tomographic plaque quantification of the entire coronary tree. Future studies are warranted to establish a clinically relevant threshold of total coronary plaque progression by serial coronary CT angiography assessment, end quote. So my question to the authors here, Nick Norwitz, Dave Feldman, Adrian Sotomota, Matthew Budoff, etc., agreed upon by who? Firstly, per your reference, I do not see clear agreement that a percent atheroma volume change of greater than 1% is considered rapid, and anything under that is not. Secondly, even if there was agreement, this doesn't mean that an annual change in percent atheroma volume of 0.8% is low risk or represents stable plaque. Just because I'm not sprinting doesn't mean I'm standing still. I could be jogging very quickly. The bottom line here is that any threshold is likely arbitrary. It's not just below 1% equals no risk and above equals rapid. Whether we look at the non-calcified plaque volume or the percent atheroma volume data from this 12-month study and compare it to other cohorts, there is need for significant pause. While there certainly may be a few outliers, and there is, which the authors have been sure to point out, we should not be distracted from the fact that this group does not appear to be, on the aggregate, doing very well. Plus, a 0.8% increase in percent atheroma volume was just the average. 43% of subjects had a percent atheroma volume much higher than this, as Dr. Alan Flanagan describes here.
For this group that love to stress heterogeneity, this 0.8% change in percent atheroma volume was in the overall cohort, but they also considered the levels of PAV progression in individuals in the keto study that had a 10-year risk score of over 5%. So this would be akin to the intermediate risk group in Paradigm, who had a percent atheroma volume increase of 0.58%, annualized increase. The KETO-CTA 10-year risk score of over 5% showed a PAV increase over 1 year of 1.4%. And the KETO-CT participants who had evidence of CAC at baseline had an increase in PAV of 2.4%. So if they want to make this point that there is heterogeneous risk in this phenotype, then it's not necessarily incorrect. But all it is descriptive, not inferential. And importantly, this heterogeneity is observed in the context of at least intermediate, if not high risk, of percent atheroma volume plaque progression over 1 year. So it's not heterogeneous, but in the context of low risk, but for apparently one individual who had some sort of decrease. But on average, stratifying whatever way they cut it up, there is an increase in PAV progression that, as it relates to risk, is a cause for concern. And they have framed it in a way that is utterly incongruent with scientific integrity relative to the data that they have.
Next up, we must discuss the APOB component of this study. You may be wondering, based on the title of the study and perhaps media coverage or social media coverage, does this study disprove the role of LDL or APOB in the development of atherosclerosis? Do we, as some have stated, no longer need to consider APOB and instead just scan people and use their imaging to guide treatment? For example, here's what Dr. Brett Scher had to say, and I quote, "Therefore, we should likely shift away from LDL and ApoB and toward vascular imaging with coronary artery calcium score or CT angiogram for better risk prediction and informing how or if to treat someone's cardiac risk factors." End quote. Dr. Ken Berry, a prominent low-carb doctor, took this even further, using the study to support his view that humans should eat a high saturated fat diet. And I quote, "The obvious implication is that if very high ApoB levels is not a good predictor of heart attack risk in this specific group of people, then is it a good predictor in any group of people? Or is it, as I suspect, just the latest popular lab test being used to scare people away from eating a proper human diet rich in saturated fat?" End quote. Let's break this down. Firstly, and this is the key, ApoB and its association with plaque progression was not a pre-specified outcome. It was, as the authors have stated themselves, an exploratory analysis conducted after the fact. Yet as Dr. Richard Kerwin et al. Say in their letter to the editor, and I quote, "Strangely, however, this exploratory analysis was used as the basis for the title of their manuscript." To me, this screams of a lack of academic rigor. Was the study powered adequately to detect an association between ApoB level and rate of plaque progression? We don't know. If it wasn't, then we wouldn't expect it to show a correlation between ApoB level and plaque progression. Additionally, was there enough variability in ApoB exposure to detect a dose-response relationship. Remembering that there was no control group here that had low ApoB to compare to. The study simply looked at 100 people with high baseline ApoB. So they compared people with high ApoB to other people with high ApoB, which, as Dr. Brad Stanfield aptly put it, and I quote, is analogous to studying only heavy smokers. If everyone smokes 2 to 4 packs a day, you might find that cigarettes per day do not correlate with lung disease severity. But that's because the whole group is at the extreme end of the exposure. You haven't included any non-smokers for comparison. End quote. That analogy really nails it. You can't test if smoking causes disease by only looking at heavy smokers. You need to contrast it with light or non-smokers. To drive this point home, here's what Dr. Alan Flanagan had to say about this study and why there was not an association between ApoB level and rate of plaque progression.
Because it's a between individual comparison within a specific subgroup of individuals, all with high LDL cholesterol. That it's a statistical artifact, their lack of correlation, because they don't have a sufficient, we have a between individual comparison within a subgroup with very narrow variation in a risk factor that's already high over a time period that's too short to test the cumulative exposure hypothesis. And this tells us little to nothing about a between group comparison of variations in exposure. So to truly test that, you would need a corresponding group of individuals with average LDL of, let's say, 100, but just for hypothetical purposes for listeners, 100 milligrams per deciliter, and in which you also have your repeat measures of CT angiography at baseline and follow-up, and obviously then there are changes in plaque progression metrics as well, and you have the ability then to more appropriately test that between group comparison with more variation in that exposure on these outcomes. So their finding is a statistical artifact of the lack of variation in that exposure that is uniformly high. And ultimately, we've got to kind of come back then to some first principles here, because the one outcome, the two outcomes, of course, the plaque outcomes that we do have indicate plaque progression. As I said earlier, plaque doesn't beget plaque. Yes, baseline levels will influence subsequent trajectory of a risk factor, and baseline plaque is very commonly predictive of future plaque progression. But something drives plaque progression. And in these otherwise metabolically healthy individuals, the coalescence of the comprehensive body of evidence we outlined at the start would suggest to us that the phrase in medicine, when you hear hoofbeats, first think of horses rather than zebras. They're asking us to look for zebras. The answer is these hoofbeats are largely LDL cholesterol and ApoB. That is the most probabilistic answer we can come to. And their lack of statistical correlation does not refute that probability, because their data is not sufficient to more robustly test that hypothesis.
With this in mind, the important question becomes, if these subjects changed their diet or took a statin or a combination of the two and lowered their ApoB and cholesterol levels, would they have avoided the plaque progression they experienced, which on average was more than 5 times what the authors themselves estimated? Would that lead to a lower risk of cardiovascular disease events? Well, we don't know from this study. It didn't test that. But as Dr. Flanagan alluded to with his hoofbeats analogy, existing evidence from large-scale observational studies, genetic studies, and randomized controlled trials strongly suggests the answer is yes. The good news is that the authors have somewhat clarified this in their recent response to a letter to the editor, where they say, and I quote, "We completely agree our exploratory results, especially those suggesting a null association between plaque progression and ApoB, should be interpreted with caution. Our results are compatible with a causal role of ApoB in atherosclerosis, as we have openly acknowledged and supported in previous publications. Along the same lines, we would like to clarify that our title was not meant to be a statement about causality." End quote. This is a very important clarification, but unfortunately, it's buried in a letter to the editor response that most readers will never see. Instead, what the public sees is a title that suggests ApoB does not drive plaque, a message that contradicts decades of well-established evidence. In fact, some of the study's own authors have been out publicly downplaying ApoB, suggesting that a high baseline coronary artery calcium score is a more meaningful marker. The implication here being, if you don't yet have calcium buildup, then high ApoB might not matter for you. But here's what that misses and why I think that's bad advice. This was just a 12-month study. These people had been following a ketogenic diet and had high ApoB for about 5 years on average. It is entirely possible they are on a fast track toward calcification, and we just haven't observed it long enough yet. Essentially, these metabolically healthy folks with diet-induced dyslipidemia are on the aggregate laying down plaque at a rate that suggests they should at the very least be monitoring with regular imaging, and if not, assuming, based on this data, that they're laying down plaque faster than healthy people and changing their diet and or commencing appropriate medical therapy to get ApoB to goal. And if you're thinking, boy, this science sounds shaky, wait until you see how it was communicated. When news broke that this paper was published without properly detailing the primary outcome, while at the same time seemingly downplaying decades and decades of data establishing a causal relationship between ApoB and atherosclerosis, there was, to put it politely, a fair bit of outrage and frustration from scientists and the academic community at large. Dr. Jill Carvalho from Nutrition Made Simple had the senior author of this study, Dr. Matthew Budoff, on his show and asked him about some of these issues. Here's what Dr. Budoff had to say.
Everybody agrees that should have been some form of a table or something like that. It's not the end of the world.
It is in the paper. You're using that's not the final paper. The final paper is being submitted today, and it will have non-calcified plaque volume in there.
Oh, so it's
I think some of the criticisms are premature, and I blame the people whoever they uploaded a preliminary paper, not the final paper. Elsevier did not upload the final paper. The final paper does have, and it will come out, I think, today or tomorrow, non-calcified plaque volume in the methods, in the results, and in the conclusion.
Frustratingly, as mentioned earlier, we're now more than a month down the road from the date that this study was published, and the original paper has not been retracted or updated. It's worth noting that in this interview, Dr. Budoff was unsure what the median increase in non-calcified plaque volume was and seemed blindsided by the fact his co-author posted this on X.
The first author of the study came out on Twitter and he released a number. He said this is the median soft plaque increase over the year for this group. And he cited a number, 18.8 cubic millimeters. So that number's been going around for a week now. I've seen dozens of scientists looking at that, comparing to other studies, doing all kinds of graphs. But when I asked Dr. Budoff about this number, he essentially disavowed it.
And I don't even know where those numbers come from, because I'm looking at the paper and I'm looking at the raw data and I don't see 42% or 18.8 millimeters cubed.
Yeah, those are not in the currently available version. That's what I'm asking.
Okay, I'm saying, but I don't see it in the right. But then, you're quoting them, so they must be available somewhere, or somebody's making them up.
Your author on Twitter said it was 18.8. When people kept asking what's the primary outcome change, he said it's 18.8 cubic millimeters of soft plaque over the year.
Do we know who said that?
The first author. I forget his name.
Okay. All right. Well, he's not allowed to do that, and all right. I'm not on social media to debate or answer those queries. But my statistician does the math, and my statistician hasn't released a number that's in public. So I don't know where he got that number. But I don't believe it's that number. But I don't know. I don't have the final draft yet. We are literally working on it.
Gotcha.
We're waiting for the proofs. We don't even have the proofs yet from Elsevier. This is very premature. The proofs haven't been approved yet. I haven't approved any version of the paper yet. So this pre-draft or this draft is incomplete because I haven't gone through it and approved anything yet. This is the senior author will proof the final draft and correct any mistakes. We are certainly taking into advisement issues that were raised to the journal or to other authors, but the first author should not and could not be putting out numbers that are not in the paper. And I don't know if he has the right numbers because I don't think it came from my statistician.
Thanks to the study group's letter to the editor response, we can now confirm that the median increase in non-calcified plaque volume was in fact 18.9 millimeters cubed. The mean was 31.5 millimeters cubed. These are numbers that we went through earlier. Again, the original paper has not been updated to include these. So I'm still not sure why Dr. Butoff was referring to the paper as a draft. If it was a draft and if it was an error that the median and the mean non-calcified plaque volume was missing, it should have been corrected in the final version. Another point that Dr. Carvalho brings up in this conversation with Dr. Butoff that I think is important and worth underlining and has not been addressed by the authors is the statement that, and I quote, most participants presented with stable non-calcified plaque volume, figures 1A and 1B, with one participant exhibiting a decrease in non-calcified plaque volume, end quote. Now this seems disingenuous to me if we look at figure 2A. While it's true that 1 out of 100 people exhibited a small decrease in non-calcified plaque volume and a few with essentially no change, everyone else had an increase. Again, with the mean increase in non-calcified plaque volume being 31.5 millimeters cubed.
Figure 2B, what it looks like is 90+% of the dots are in the direction of growth. 1 is a reduction, and there's maybe 3 or 4 that are on the line of no change. This is the figure that's available to everyone. I don't know if...
Yeah, I see figure 2.
2B, yeah.
2B, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, the version that's available to everyone that everybody's been criticizing, basically that sentence doesn't match this at all. It just seems really strange. Maybe there was a mistake with the kind of the writing or something, but yeah, this looks like overwhelmingly there's growth to varying degrees, of course, maybe one regression and a couple that are stable, but 90-something% of the participants seem to have a growth of plaque, and that's not kind of explained anywhere in the text. And then a lot of the messaging on social media also has not emphasized that whatsoever, kind of the opposite. It has not talked about this, and that's one of the concerns that I've seen kind of voiced over and over. But yeah, if you guys are working on a revision, this would be good to clarify.
But yes, let me understand what the criticism is, or what the...
Yeah. The criticism, like when I read it, the text says most participants presented with stable soft plaque, but the figure shows over 90% seems like growth.
But talking about presenting with soft plaque has nothing to do with growth. Presenting with soft plaque means what's on the baseline scan.
No, with stable. Presented with stable soft plaque.
Presented with, that means the first scan.
Well,
presented means scan number 1. I'm not sure how else to read that.
Yeah, I don't
know how to read it differently.
So the rest of the sentence
perfectly clear.
Yeah.
I'm reading it.
Okay. The rest of the sentence.
Presenting with is the first scan, right? That's what present means.
I don't think so. I think it's referring to the change because it's pointing to figure 1 and B. And then if you continue the sentence, it says with one participant exhibiting a decrease in soft plaque, right? So it's referring to the change. It's highlighting the one guy that's below the line, but calling everybody else stable. It looks incredibly strange to anyone.
Yeah, I think they were trying to talk about the baseline presentation. I wrote the group to clarify that sentence because I don't understand it exactly either, but okay. I don't think that was the intent, was to say that they didn't have progression. But yeah, I'll have to go back. Yeah.
It's good news that this is being rewritten.
Again, this hasn't been rectified or reflected in the published paper. And just to make this point super clear why this is important, there's nothing stable about the plaque progression in these subjects. They presented with a percent atheroma volume of 1.6%, and in just a single year, this increased by 0.8%. In absolute terms, this means their plaque increased by 50% in a single year. If we take the data from this single year and assume that percent atheroma volume increases by 50% each year, which I acknowledge is an assumption, it's based on only a year's worth of data, you'll notice in the graph on screen or in the show notes for those listening that this 50% increase gets bigger and bigger in terms of absolute plaque as time goes on. In other words, it compounds. What I really want to draw your attention to here, more than the projections into the future, is that in just the past year, these subjects laid down 1/2 of the plaque that they had grown across their previous 50 odd years of life. That is not based on an assumption, nor is it debatable. If this is what stability looks like to the authors, I'd hate to see what rapid progression means. And remember, let's not lose sight of the fact that this was a cohort of lean, metabolically healthy, asymptomatic individuals, people who many claim are low risk. Now imagine what this would look like in someone eating a ketogenic diet with high ApoB who has hypertension, insulin resistance, or type 2 diabetes, which is many people within the ketogenic community. So what we're left with is an original paper that inappropriately focuses on an exploratory outcome in the title, inappropriately labels the study as a trial, fails to clearly report the primary outcome, and uses ambiguous language like most participants presented with stable non-calcified plaque volume to describe the results. My concern with this is that trust in science in general is eroding at a rapid pace. And look, don't get me wrong, mistakes are fine. They're totally allowed and normal. We're all human. But when errors like this occur, in order to maintain the integrity of science, there has to be clear accountability. There has to be clear responsibility. And there has to be rectification. When people go on the record saying that there will be changes made and then they aren't, we're all left guessing as to what we should really believe. And in the absence of accountability and rectification, what spreads fastest? Misinformation that confirms biases. And there are real-world, widespread implications of these oversights, errors, or miscommunications. Whatever we want to call them, it's led to mainstream media headlines like this one from Fox News, and I quote, "Low-carb keto diet may not raise heart disease risk. New study suggests," end quote. This sort of headline gives people the impression that eating a low carbohydrate diet that's rich in saturated fats from animal foods like butter, bacon, and other meats is heart healthy. But if you look at the actual data and how it compares to other populations, a much more accurate headline would be something like, "New study suggests ketogenic diet accelerates heart disease, even in healthy people." That's the story here. I will note that as I was editing this episode, I have heard rumblings that some of the authors are now questioning the Clearly software, the AI software that was used to measure plaque progression in this study. It seems that they have or may have come around to the fact that most subjects in this study did not have stable plaque and in fact saw rapid plaque progression, placing them at intermediate or high risk of cardiovascular disease, but are now trying to explain that progression away by calling into question the software used to analyze the scans. I really do wonder if they'll ever come to terms with the fact that slamming bacon, fatty cuts of steak, and pats of butter, as delicious as they may not be that great for their arteries. To close this out, let's hear from Dr. Jill Carvalho and Dr. Alan Flanagan, and then finish with some take-home points from me.
In one of the last sections of the paper, the authors write, "Our data should be reassuring for these patients and their physicians." Now, maybe this will change in the revised version of the paper, but the data, as I see it, does not reassure me. And it wouldn't reassure me if I was in the skin of these guys. 90 to 95% of people showing plaque progression. If we look at average of the population, it's in the ballpark of sick Western populations. We compare it to Westerners that are not that sick. It seems several-fold higher. None of this seems very reassuring to me. I know there's heterogeneity. Not everybody's at the same level of risk. But as a rule, this doesn't seem very reassuring to me. Using
the word trial implies certain characteristics of an intervention, including, randomization or control conditions, and there's none of that. So this is a loose observational study that simply has, a baseline and follow-up scan over 1 year. And I think we really have to come back to the fact that if we are really looking at the data and only the data and kind of forgetting the noise for a second, there's really only one conclusion that we can come to. And in one way, for a group that love putting a spin on things, here's this for a kind of approach. This group posited that individuals with diet-induced very high LDL cholesterol levels are a unique phenotype, that perhaps there's unique underlying lipid metabolism that explains their very high levels of LDL cholesterol. cholesterol, and that perhaps they exhibit, because of their other healthy markers, a different cardiovascular risk profile. And forgetting their cross-sectional study, they've ultimately come along with this study now and refuted their own hypothesis. We very clearly have, in their own data, evidence of plaque progression. That plaque progression exceeds what we would expect to see from otherwise healthy individuals. It certainly exceeds what we would expect to see in individuals that are low cardiovascular risk, and approximates even greater to what we would see with intermediate risk. And so within all of that, despite their kind of analyses in the paper, which again are flawed in terms of the design of this study and the statistical artifact of the lack of relationship with LDL and ApoB, the most plausible reason why we've seen plaque progression in this group is, I would say, their elevation in LDL cholesterol and ApoB. Either way, if we are just thinking about the outcomes they have demonstrated, they have clearly demonstrated that these individuals are not healthy, quote unquote, and they are not a low risk phenotype. They are probably best characterized as a higher risk phenotype.
Science communications issues aside, I do want to be clear that I am grateful, genuinely grateful this research was done and that the data was made available, because it confirms what many experts have long suspected. People following a ketogenic diet who have severely elevated ApoB or LDL cholesterol, even if they're lean fit, even if they're metabolically healthy, appear to be laying down arterial plaque at an accelerated rate. Now, sure, as mentioned earlier, there is individual variation, and those outliers absolutely worth exploring further. But there is variation or heterogeneity, as described in the literature, within most studies. That variation shouldn't distract us from the general picture that we're seeing. On the whole, the takeaway from this study is clear. Right now, it would be ethically irresponsible to recommend to someone to eat this way, without also explaining that it appears to increase the risk of atherosclerosis and, by extension, heart attacks or strokes. No matter how good your triglycerides, glucose, or abs look. If you're someone who is enjoying a ketogenic or a low-carb diet, has high cholesterol, and are now wondering what to do next, firstly, don't let this be about ideology, about groupthink or fitting into some community. It's about your arteries and what's happening to them as you follow this diet. Let go of the idea that ApoB doesn't apply to you just because you feel good, you look fit, or have good metabolic health markers. As the authors themselves have stated, their commentary on ApoB, and I quote, should be interpreted with caution, end quote, because quite frankly, it was an exploratory analysis, and as we've gone through, plaque progression in this group was much, much more rapid than we typically see in truly healthy individuals. If you want to protect your arteries and protect your heart, which I hope you do, the science is clear. It's time to optimize your ApoB through diet, medication, or both, while also managing other risk factors like blood pressure, fasting blood glucose, HbA1c, triglycerides, etc. What is an optimal ApoB level to strive for? Well, this depends on your risk of cardiovascular disease. Dr. Thomas Dayspring recommends 80 milligrams per deciliter or lower for someone who is low risk, and even lower for those that are at moderate or high risk of cardiovascular disease. I'll link to a short video in the show notes where he explains this in more detail. If you're ready to make evidence-based changes to protect your long-term health, that is certainly a great place to start. And with that, I think this is a good place to land the plane. If this video helped clarify the science, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to help others cut through the noise. I really do think we need more reality-based conversations around health, and your support certainly makes that possible. And if you made it to the end of this sucker, the least I can do here is leave you with a cheap laugh. You ready? Here we go. Why did the coffee file a police report? It got mugged. If that isn't worthy of hitting subscribe and leaving a comment or two, I'll be damned. See you next week, guys.